We did see another round of protests on the streets in Hong Kong over the weekend. Just wonder what your assessment of this latest rally was. It was quite peaceful. Does that have something to do with the granting of a rare permit?
Well, there was no tears and no tear gas. The organisers estimated an 800,000 people turnout. I took part in it and walked from Causeway Bay a couple of miles to Central. And I'd say it was smaller than the 16th of June and larger than the 9th of June, which makes it the second largest protest since 1989 over Tiananmen Square. The unaddressed issue is the democratic deficit, that the people of Hong Kong cannot elect fully their legislature and certainly not their chief executive, and so there's no accountability for the policy making.
Well, the protesters, of course, have that famous refrain, 5 demands, not one less. But I'm just wondering how you're gauging progress towards those 5 demands. And I'm thinking in particular, we see the American Chamber of Commerce heads being denied entry to Macau over the weekend with no explanation given. So does it seem to you that perhaps things are drifting the other way?
They are. There's clearly a blacklist. There was a somewhat ludicrous explanation out of Macau overnight that they never take into account the background or occupation of the people they ban. Of course they do, or at least Beijing does when providing them with the blacklist. So that's tightening up. Of the 5 demands, obviously one has been met, the withdrawal of the extradition bill. Of the other 4, one of them is prime to the others. The others are subsidiary, and the demand is for democracy in Hong Kong, because if you had a democratic government, then of course they would launch an independent commission of inquiry into the protests and the leading up to that, the government's introduction of the bill in the first place, and they would also address the calls for amnesty, perhaps for the non-violent offenders, because there are just so many people who have taken part in so-called illegal assemblies, and they would only get small sentences anyway of 100 hours of community service. So what's the point? But obviously it all takes a backseat to democracy, and if the government's not willing to do anything about that, then eventually there's going to have to be a crackdown against the continued protests.
I want to ask you about that because, you in a recent piece, it's a fascinating piece, you make the point that people hoped that Hong Kong would survive long enough that China would continue on a path towards more liberal democracy, right? And you point out that since Xi Jinping took over, it's going the opposite direction. So how is this going to play out? If there's a crackdown, is it going to be a violent crackdown that is very damaging not only to Hong Kong, but potentially China's standing in the world? Will it be an intermediate crackdown that everybody can live with somehow?
We don't know is the short answer. I think it could take a number of things. Certainly there would be a tightening of the laws in Hong Kong. There is a case going through the courts now on something called the Emergency Regulations Ordinance, which Carrie Lam tested earlier this year by introducing her own law against face masks during assemblies. And if the first instance court has said that law is unconstitutional, you can't make your own laws, that's what your legislature is for, you can't bypass them. That will then go up to appeal, and at some point Beijing may intervene and issue its own decision, which they can do under the basic law, to override the courts here. They've done it before. And that would mean that Carrie Lam would then be clear, or whoever the chief executive is, to issue new laws, for example, for internment without trial of so-called terrorists or rioters, cracking down on the internet applications and blocking VPNs and extending the Great Firewall of China around Hong Kong, and basically banning public assemblies and introducing very severe penalties for those. And there's a number of other things that they could do which would affect the laws here. And then, of course, there's the actual enforcement of those laws, and they might need to call in the People's Armed Police, who have been massing on the other side of the border, or to call the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, out of their barracks, and their numbers have reportedly increased in the last few months as well.
Sure.
If it's bloody, if it's a crackdown, you can expect the US to invoke its own legislation and probably de-recognize Hong Kong, and other places would follow as a special part of China. And that, of course, would affect the economy.
Well, David, in light of all this, I'm just so impressed by people who continue to protest when ultimately they can see this threat out there as you can. Does this underscore I think something else you've argued, people talk about this being the economic reasons for the protests, the fact that there's not enough housing, and the wealthy billionaires of Hong Kong have not put enough in to change things. Again, this determination speaks to the fact that this is really definitely mostly about democracy and where Hong Kong's heading.
Sure, you would get a different set of land and housing policies and fiscal taxation policies and so on if you had a democratically elected government. But what it comes down to is that very issue. If you look at the fact that office workers who are in the upper income brackets are coming out at lunchtimes and protesting, if you look at the fact that about 60% of the vote was pro-democracy in the district council elections last week or the week before, that demonstrates the breadth of feeling and the fear of losing what freedoms we have because we don't have democracy in Hong Kong. It was always hoped that we would get that from 2007 onwards, and that would stave off any encroachment by the mainland into the Hong Kong system until the mainland itself eventually becomes a liberal democracy. And I think it will eventually, because no large-scale economy on earth has delivered rising prosperity beyond reasonable limits without having that freedom and getting rid of all its centrally planned enterprises, which they currently still have. They've listed lots of companies in Hong Kong and Shanghai, but they're still controlled by the government.
To your point that you made a minute ago about the Hong Kong Policy Act or the risk of a bloody crackdown leading to the US striking out Hong Kong's special status, would that not merely, though, just hasten Hong Kong's assimilation into broader China?
It could do. I mean, if all of the major countries of the world have withdrawn recognition as a special region of China, the mainland government might just give up the pretense that there's still one country and two systems. They would hang on to that as long as they can because it's important to them, it's symbolic, and they want to keep the separate open capital markets in Hong Kong that they don't have in China, and so forth. But at some point they might just throw in the towel on that, and at least then you could drive freely from Hong Kong to Macau across the bridge without needing three different insurance policies for three jurisdictions. So there would be some small upsides to full integration, but obviously that it would be a proof of a failed experiment on one country, two systems. I think it's more likely that after a crackdown that Beijing would pretend that the basic law was still functioning, that the Hong Kong government asked for assistance militarily and got it, and then they would wait it out in the way that the China government did after Tiananmen Square. There obviously had to be a period of purdah, but then Bill Clinton's presidency re-engaged with China, and by the end of that presidency, they've been admitted to the World Trade Organization.
Now, in terms of impact on the economy, the effect on the retail sector has been pretty pronounced. But if we look at other parts, property prices holding up pretty well. The Hang Seng is still up on year, and if we take a look at this chart on the Bloomberg terminal, we can see that implied volatility on the Hang Seng does remain below historical averages. So I guess the question is, are you surprised by that, and how long do you think it can persist?
Not really. 2/3 of the Hang Seng Index is mainland companies like Tencent or China Mobile or PetroChina. The valuations of those are not greatly affected by what happens in Hong Kong, and there's also arbitrage with the mainland stock prices in Shanghai and Shenzhen to some extent. Also, I think there's been a fair amount of mainland buying offsetting any overseas selling of the Hong Kong stock market. So it's not really surprising that it's been fairly stable. Property prices have been trending down, but of course those reflect the net present value of future rentals, and no one's yet clear on what the demand for that property might be. Post a crackdown, probably it would be lower than it would be if Hong Kong introduced democracy and restored harmony that way. And that's why I've been calling on the tycoons to get out of the way, to give up their corporate voting in the VegCo and in the election committee that chooses the chief executive. And in fact, the chief executive has the ability within Hong Kong laws, without going to Beijing, to democratically reform the whole process and introduce an accountable government simply by abolishing corporate voting and replacing it with one worker, one vote in each of the so-called small circle functional constituencies.